You're listening to Masonry Principles, your guide to building better buildings, with hosts Amanda Bedian and Phil Leden. And thanks for listening to Masonry Principles. Today's episode, we've got Brian Trimble with the International Masonry Institute. Thanks for being here, Brian.
Good morning.
Good morning. How's everything going in your world?
Well, thank you very much.
Very good. So, Brian, can we just start off with who, what, where, why with International Masonry Institute, aka IMI?
Right. So I work for the International Masonry Institute. We're a group that is funded by the bricklayers and allied craft workers, and also the mason contractors who hire those folks. We represent union masonry across the country, and we do two things. One is technical services, which I'm a part of, but we also do all the training. So all the people who go through apprenticeships and so on, they go through our training procedures and become journey level masons. As well as tile setters and everything else. So it's not just brick and block and stone. It's also tile, terrazzo, cement finishing, restoration, you name it, and we get involved in it. If it involves a trowel, we're there.
You're there, and you're in the facilities in Bowie, Maryland.
Our headquarters are in Bowie, but we have training centers all across the United States. I'd say we probably have about 60 at this point.
Okay, perfect. And then Brian, you're out of Pennsylvania, but you cover a big territory. What territory is that?
Yeah, so I live in the Pittsburgh area, and I cover Western PA and Western New York. So all the great places in the United States.
What is that, the Rust Belt?
You could call it that, but we're much better than that.
Yeah. We wanted to bring you on board and just talk about all the different hats you've worn throughout your career, knowing that you work for IMI now, but then you have a background in brick.
Yeah, so actually, I started out working for a brick manufacturer. I graduated from Penn State with a degree in architectural engineering, and then start working for a brick manufacturer. And then from there, went to the BIA. At that time, it was the Brick Institute of America. They've eventually morphed into the Brick Industry Association. I worked there off and on for about 20 years, and have now worked at IMI for almost 10.
Wow, impressive. So, what are some things that IMI is doing right now that you think people should be aware of?
Well, actually, one of the things that we've been involved in recently is looking at prefabrication and offsite construction. Again, we keep hearing about this over and over again in different locations, and it's like, well, how does this affect the masonry industry? And in reality, we have had prefabrication for decades, and it's only been more recently that people have sort of morphed that into modular construction and offsite construction. And again, that's happening. We have a lot of examples around the United States where our mason contractors are actually doing this work. It's more of a one-off kind of thing. It's not consistent, and so we want to just sort of see how our masons can get involved in this, how masonry can stay involved in this, because again, we hear a lot about other products being used in modular construction, but masonry is well suited to that. So that's one of the big things we're doing recently.
Oh, so in terms of other products, I mean, we see a lot of cold form studs, kind of, stucco systems. I mean, how competitive are we with masonry prefabrication? And I mean, do we have an opportunity here to recapture some of that market that's maybe gone to some of these other systems?
We do, and again, it depends on what kinds of projects you're talking about. If you're talking about high-rise, buildings and things like that, maybe that's not for us. But any kind of educational facility, any kind of low-rise to medium-rise structures, we can do that. I mean, there's been examples of prefabrication of stair towers, of shaft walls, which everything. Well, that's way too heavy, but in reality, it can be done on site rather efficiently and lifted into place. So there are some niches for us. Is not going to be overall building types and so on, but it'll certainly be in a good portion.
Okay, and I see on LinkedIn, I mean, I know you said you're in the technical division as well. I mean, you guys do a lot of training and things for architects and engineers as well. Can you kind of talk about some of that? 'Cause a lot of our listeners, I think, are more on the design side of things. We do have a lot of
Right.
contractors as well, but what kind of resources do you have for them?
Oh, a ton. So, we have 15 to 17 different IMI people like myself scattered across the country. We all do our own educational programs for architects and engineers. Of course, more recently with the pandemic, we've been doing mostly national webinars. And so that has certainly drawn a lot of people. We often have anywhere between 400 and 500 people attending some of our webinars. So that's great. In a normal year, we do a lot of lunch and learns, getting out to the designers, reviewing their plans, reviewing their specifications. I mean, everything that a local masonry institute does, like yours, Phil's, and Amanda, and so on. We do, and we try to offer that in-person service as much as we can.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's a really great resource that, hopefully people are aware of. I mean, if you have 4 to 500 people, it sounds like at least people are taking advantage of it, which is great. In addition to that role, I guess through I guess I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about your role through TMS because I think our listeners probably aren't aware, but the TMS and how it gets written. I mean, we're in that 2022 code cycle right now, and you've kind of taken on the veneer chapter. So I was kind of hoping you'd be able to shed a little bit of light on how that's going, where we're going with that.
Yeah, so I mean, I've always been involved in TMS, the Masonry Society, and I've been on it sort of peripherally for years. In this last code cycle of the TMS 402-602, which again, formerly ACI 530, some of our listeners may remember that number, but the TMS 402-602, I was drafted into being chair of the veneer subcommittee, veneer glass block, and I didn't maybe realize what I was getting into when I agreed to that. But John Chrysler of the Masonry Institute of America, he's the chairman of the TMS 402-602 committee, thought I'd do a good job at that. And actually, it's been really, really enjoyable and interesting because as many of you know, codes are developed typically on a 3-year cycle. If you talk about the International Building Code, the IBC, and other material codes, they're usually on a 3-year cycle. TMS made a conscious decision to go to a 6-year cycle to make it easier for designers trying to learn all these codes on such a consistent basis. So we're in a 6-year cycle. The last version of the TMS 402-602 was 2016. The next one will be 2022. That extra time has given us time to really look at the code and see where we can make some major upgrades. And veneer was one of those chapters. It's good. Previous versions of the veneer chapter, are decent. They're certainly provide life safety and performance and things like that. But again, the ease of use and again giving more information, I think was sort of lacking. We did a lot of research, or there was a lot of research that was done. We actually had a veneer summit where we talked about potential things where we could change in the veneer chapter, and that resulted in a lot of suggestions. And we put that together in a ballot, and it's been going up the chain ever since.
And so, I mean, in our previous versions of the code, we basically had 2 ways to design veneer, right? We had the prescriptive approach, or you could engineer the veneer system. I mean, across the country, are you seeing, most people using the prescriptive method, or where's the design community kind of at right now?
Yeah, so everybody wants to use the prescriptive method because it's easy. So you go into the code and you say, okay, this is what I have. What are my wall tie spacings? What's the maximum height of my veneer? And you're done. There's obviously more to it than that, but those are the prescriptive path. The engineered path, has to be taken whenever you don't meet some of those prescriptive requirements, whether that may be in a certain seismic zone or a certain wind loading area. If your veneer corbels out more than the allowed amount that's in prescriptive and so on. There's a lot of times that we fall into that sort of or outside of the prescriptive requirements, and we have to go to more engineered design. Now, the older versions of the TMS 402 veneer chapter didn't really give you a whole lot of guidance. They had like a bullet of 4 things you had to consider, but they really didn't tell you anything more than that. The revision of the chapter hopefully will have some new requirements in there. There's a tributary area method now that is a quasi-engineered method that people can use. A lot of this is based on the strength of the ties. I mean, again, a veneer is non-load bearing. And basically it transfers all the loads to the backing through those veneer ties. And so a lot of the requirements for engineer design relate to those wall ties or veneer ties.
And in terms of, I guess, wall heights, I mean, as much as I hate it, we do see a lot of brick with other backup materials other than block. And so I know previous codes, I mean, we had some height restrictions of, 30 feet, 35 at our peak. Is any of that changing in the new code?
Not really. I mean, those limits have actually performed very well for us over the years. So it's 30 foot off the foundation and then 38 foot to the top of a gable. And those numbers are, it's not based on strength or things like that. It's actually revolving around differential movement. So brick grows over time, and concrete masonry or wood or whatever that shrinks. And so we need to take that differential movement into account. And so that 30-foot prescriptive limitation in there is really a reminder saying, hey, you need to do something at this point. So I've seen plenty of veneers that go 40 feet, 45 feet, and so on with no shelf angles. and they perform fine, but they've taken that differential movement into account. And so I think the new revision of the veneer chapter is going to cover that maybe a little bit better than in the past.
I guess one of my pet peeves too. I mean, I like how you said shelf angle. I mean, I all the time see them called relief or relieving angles. Can you talk about that? I guess.
Yeah, so you need to read my article from Structure Magazine from many years ago. Do relieving angles really relieve? And
I have read that article.
yeah, so again, I guess at one time it was a pet peeve of mine too. I'm a little more relaxed about that now and so on. But again, the idea is that a shelf angle is there for movement. It's not there to relieve any kind of stresses. I mean, you could actually stack a brick wall 1,000 feet high before you'd ever crush it. So, putting an angle in there to help relieve any load on brick that's not the reason why. It's there so that you can put a soft joint or an open joint beneath that angle. The brickwork can expand and contract like it wants to. The building frame can move like it wants to without detrimentally impacting each other.
Right, right. Yeah, that's one of my pet peeves, but I'm softening on it too. In terms of the veneer chapter, I guess a lot of our listeners aren't really involved in the code writing process. Would you mind shedding a little bit of light on how codes get written from a balloting perspective and kind of a voting perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it is pretty rigorous. So first of all, you have to have a balanced committee. I mean, we all follow ANSI procedures, which means that it's a consensus process. So you have all sides of the subject, from manufacturers to users to general interest to professors and academics and so on. So all those people are on the committee, and then you start off with some ideas, and they go through a subcommittee process. And at that subcommittee level, a lot of things get worked out first. And so there's a lot of discussion that happens at that point. And then once you've finally satisfied all the people, and again, you have to, anybody who votes negative on these ballots, you have to address those. And it has to be written and it has to be approved by the entire subcommittee. And then once that reaches that point, then you can send it to the main committee. The main committee does the exact same thing. They look at it. If there are any negatives or comments about that, you have to resolve those first. If you find something that has to be changed, it gets kicked back to the subcommittee level. The subcommittee looks at the revised language. They approve it. Then it goes back to main. So it's a pretty rigorous process as it goes through. And we have some very adept engineers on these committees who really look at every word, which is good. You want that, but as a subcommittee chair, I want to get these things done. So it's a balance.
Definitely, and I guess with moving to a 6-year code cycle, I mean, I think, from my perspective, because I sit on a couple subcommittees through TMS as well, I think it's given us a lot more opportunity to make a lot more kind of overall changes. So I think it's been a really positive.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, again, we have GFRP reinforcing bars that are going to be in this new veneer chapter. We've moved information on limit design from an appendix into the code itself. Actually, one of the best resources recently here is Structure Magazine had an article in their May issue by Dr. Richard Bennett, who talked about all the changes that are coming, not just with the veneer chapter, but the entire code. And so that's a good resource I think people can look at, and then just wait for the code to come out in 2022.
And then wait for it to be adopted by our local building codes in whatever jurisdiction we're in.
Whenever that happens. So I want to mention is, okay, so I talked about the subcommittee and main committee levels. There's also two other levels that this code goes through, again, to make sure that these things are safe. One, it goes through the technical activities committee, which again is a special group of TMS members who look at it under a microscope, basically. And so they provided comments. In fact, we had 430 TAC comments, technical advisory committee comments, that we had to address. And so we did that over the last year and a half. And then now we are ready for public comment. So all those TAC comments have been addressed. And now any engineer or any designer, for that matter, can look at this revisions that we're proposing and make any comments. So if they don't like something or they think something could be better, they're free to make comments. And then again, the subcommittee and the main committee have to address all those public comments to the satisfaction of ANSI requirements. And that's why it's still, this is a 2022 code. We're still working on it. Now we're pretty well set on a lot of things, but again, things can change between now and the time of publication.
Definitely, and I guess, I mean, looking at things from a market share perspective, I think in Michigan, we're seeing a lot more concrete masonry veneers and, stone veneers. I guess, IMI being more national, do you have any perspective on what type of veneers are being used out there, I guess, nationally?
Yeah, well, again, so All kinds. So, brick, concrete masonry, stone, cast stone, all those different products are being used. Now, the one thing I do have to say is a lot of new veneers are thinner. So our traditional, full thickness brick veneers and so on, we're seeing a lot more adhered veneers being used. So now you're gluing or, adhering those units onto the backing and so on. So things like rain screen walls, that has become very popular. Brick is the original rain screen. We've had a cavity or an airspace in there for decades, and so on. It's just more recently that people have coined it a rain screen and so on. But I see things going thinner. And again, I think this new veneer chapter certainly updates a lot of the requirements for adhered veneers. The last few issues have been good, but they certainly could be beefed up, and I think we've done this with this new version.
Are we seeing issues, I guess, with adhered veneers with contractors, constructing them?
Yes. A lot of these things come from residential applications where there just aren't as many requirements. So it's fine on a one-story house, but when you put it onto a 16-story building and so on, you need to do some extra things. And that certainly came true in the 1960s when they went brick veneer steel studs. They used a lot of requirements for just general stud construction, and that was fine for residential. But when you put it onto a 16-story building, some of those requirements just didn't show to be very durable. And so I think the same thing here is people have used different types of mortar setting beds and things like that. One of the big things with the new veneer chapter, it will require a polymer modified mortar to adhere these adhered units to the backing. So that's different than a lot of things we're dealing with right now with Type S, which again is okay and so on. But again, we've seen a lot of failures where units are popping off, and part of it's due to installation, but also again is the materials that'll help bond those adhered units better to the backing.
Gotcha. I mean, some of the other changes, like you said, I mean, there was over 400 TAC comments. I'm trying to think of some of the other big changes that are coming. I know in our 2016 version, we did increase our prescriptive limit for the face of our backup, basically to the face of our brick. Is that changing in the new code as well? As I guess we put more insulation in our cavities. Is there any changes there?
Actually, that is one of the things that has not changed very much. So, from the 2013 to the 2016 version, we went from a 4.5-inch cavity to a 6 and 5/8 inch cavity in some particular aspects of adjustable ties and things like that. That actually hit that 6 and 5/8 has actually been maintained in this new version. But again, if people are still familiar with the 2013, which again, many states are still using that version, they're still using 4.5. And so in the 2016 and now in the 2022, it'll be basically a 6 inch cavity. And again, that takes care of a lot of requirements for that increased insulation in there. And then of course, when you go above that, then of course you have to do engineering. And again, that's where the other parts of this chapter, the new parts of this chapter will come into play.
Right. And I mean, the 1 inch airspace, is that staying the same in the new code as well?
It is, yeah. And the other thing is, I think we've also beefed up the section on water penetration resistance. It was sort of stuck in an odd place within the veneer chapter in the past, and now we pull that out clearly into a section of its own. And again, it's the IBC covers things like flashing and weeps and so on. So we have that IBC requirement, and then the veneer chapter adds on to that about airspace requirements and so on.
I guess from a water penetration perspective, we did an episode with Jeff Snyder kind of talking about flashings and different products that, Mason Pro sells nationally. I mean, are you seeing a trend, I guess, as far as different flashing materials or things within our cavities?
Well, a couple things. So yes, I mean, I think we're pretty good with different types of adhered flashing and so on, the rubberized asphalt type materials and so on. I do have to say that we see a lot more stainless steel drip edges than we did before. I think that's always been out there, and of course, people would always wanted to try to use a stainless steel flashing as a membrane, but that again is too expensive. So I think having the rubberized asphalt along with the stainless steel drip edge, I think is a good compromise. I have seen a lot more thin stainless steel sheets being used. Of course, in the old days, it was coated copper products and so on. If anybody remembers the asphalt coated copper and things like that, those have gone by the wayside. Copper obviously is way too expensive and so on. So I think a thin sheet of copper with a polyethylene sheet and products like that have become much more popular. And again, it provides durability, but there are also a lot of flexibility involved in that too.
Definitely. And I mean, I think from an overall performance perspective, I mean, I think cavity construction, I mean, it's proven the test of time, right, from a moisture perspective, and I think it's a fantastic system.
Yeah, we hear so much about all these new systems that are out there and new materials and so on. And it's like, well, what has the masonry industry done? Well, it's like, well, we sort of did this over the last 2 to 5,000 years. So it's pretty well thought out and things like that. So we have some nuances that we, put in play. But, we're a pretty durable material. And again, I think people realize that.
Definitely, and I guess, I mean, as we think, I guess, back to the shelf angle or relieving angle, as most people call them, the one detail that I see issues on all the time is kind of that lipped brick detail, which I know the veneer chapter is not going to specifically address, but I mean, throughout your career, have you seen any or have any recommendations on how to make that detail a little bit better?
Yeah, don't use a lip brick. So so, no, to be a little funny there, on IMI's website, we have a thing called the Masonry Detailing Series. A lot of great, details that are out there, and they show a lipped brick detail, and one of the things we actually show is a lipped brick underneath the angle. So, traditionally, the lip brick is set on top of the angle, and again, that's where the flashing is located, and of course, how do you get that flashing around the toe of the brick and so on? And so in some cases, you can actually turn it upside down, and now sitting on top of the angle is a regular brick. And so it's much easier to flash, those kind of situations. So our MDS, our masonry detailing series, shows some things like that. And again, the reason for a lip brick in the first place is that steel angle gets pretty large. And we want to also have a gap beneath the angle to allow movement to occur. And with all those requirements, that joint gets rather large. And so the lip brick helps hide that. Now, the other thing that's sort of happening here recently is issues with thermal bridging. And people are concerned about all the steel that's surrounding our building that provides a direct path for, heat or cold to move in or out of our buildings. And at shelf angles, obviously, you do have a certain amount of thermal bridging there. So we're seeing more offset angles where now there's brackets every 2 to 4 feet that are placed that support that angle to the backing. When you go to that kind of system, now that size, that angle shrinks back to sort of what it was originally, and so maybe, in those kind of situations, maybe a lift brick may not be necessary.
Yeah, I think, I mean, where I've seen issues with it is just in the design drawings. It, lands perfectly in a bed joint, but no one really ever courses things out, and so I mean,
Right. I don't know. I've seen some architects go to the nth degree about coursing and things like that. And of course, then they course it 2¼ inches high plus 3/8 inch joint, and they do all their drawings in that way. But actually, it's 3/4 to 8 inches, which is a 2¼ high brick with a mortar joint of 0.416667 in thickness. So we see a lot of people, yeah, missing their coursing too. So whatever. Aren't there some computer programs out there, Phil, that help us with that?
we did an episode with, Mike Riva and Masonry IQ, and I guess, I mean, yeah, it's a
Yeah,
nice plug for them that, people
yeah,
can be using
yeah,
that.
yeah. That could help us out.
I guess that handles, kind of expansion in the vertical direction, kind of in the horizontal direction. Another issue that we see, and I took maybe 5 calls last week about it, is designers just aren't showing control joints or expansion joints really in their drawings. I mean, they cover it with some sort of vague note about provide them at 25 foot on center. I mean, and I don't think that's exclusive to Michigan. I mean, is that a problem we're seeing around the country?
Yeah, it's all over, unfortunately. And again, it's a fear to a certain extent because designers aren't that familiar with masonry, or they're just afraid of putting these lines on their drawings that could be wrong, and so they don't. Which is, let's leave it up to the mason. Well, again, a trained craft worker, certainly knows sort of where these things go, but they're not designers. They don't know the implications of putting, for example, a control joint and a block backup. I mean, we have shear walls that are meant to, take load, and you put a joint in there haphazardly, and that affects the performance of the entire assembly. Now, veneers, again, it's something that's sitting out in front of all this, so maybe it's not quite as critical as a control joint in a block wall. But yeah, it's the designers who should be doing this. And again, we provide free services to designers to help them place that. And again, I'm sure all those calls you had ended up saying, "Well, you can do this."
Well, usually the call comes after it cracks, right? I mean, it's
Well,
not people aren't calling us before it
no, no,
happens.
that never happens.
And I guess, yeah, to the shear wall thing, I mean, with my class at Toledo, I teach them, to model where those control joints are. Because if you model a monolithic wall versus a wall broken up, I mean, stiffness, I mean, it's hundreds of percent different.
Right,
It's not just a small difference.
right.
And I think, I mean, my other pet peeve, other than I guess relieving angles, is using pot color basically at our expansion joints that matches the mortar. So can you touch on that real quickly before we close this one out?
Yeah, so Pat Conway, our associate up, my associate up in Wisconsin, is a big on this. And again, the sealant color should match the brick color, not the mortar color. And again, it just helps to blend in more. I've seen too many walls that use a white sealant, and they have this beautiful brick building, and then all of a sudden you see these big white lines on there. And the other thing, just quickly, is some people want to do a tooth expansion joint where sort of zippers goes up and down through the brick coursing. I'm not a real fan of that. I think there's problems with that. I think if you do a good sealant that matches the color of the brick, I think you're going to hide your joint pretty well.
Yeah, I agree. I think, I mean, we have seen that zipper detail too, and I think, I mean, there's definitely issues with it. If it's done right, I mean, like, it definitely is another option we have. But I'm in a complete agreement. Just match the color of the brick because we use a lot of black brick, especially where I'm located here in Michigan, and it's like when we
Sure.
use the white caulk in our joints, it just looks awful.
Right. If you want to create a statement, that's certainly one way of doing it. But in most cases, you try to hide those things.
So, Brian, I really appreciate the time this morning. Thank you so much for giving us insight into where we're going with our TMS 402. And like I mentioned, that's the 2022 version, so probably going to be adopted in what, our 2024 IBC, would you think, Brian?
Correct.
Okay. So yeah, just kind of shedding a little bit of light on that. And I mean, most states were still under that 2013 version. Hopefully, in the next couple of years, adopting our 2016 version. But that's kind of where we're going. And I mean, if anyone has questions, I mean, Brian definitely is a great resource. IMI has resources all around the country for craft workers, architects, engineers, anyone. I mean, I follow you guys on LinkedIn, and you're always sharing great content there. So I really appreciate the time today, Brian. I think you really gave our listeners a lot of great information. So thanks for listening. Thanks a lot, Brian. And I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Masonry Principles. To continue the conversation, be sure to reach out to us by visiting masonryprinciples.com.